Welcome to Palazzo Pitti, this monumental complex of museum, art gallery, and behind it the great Boboli Gardens. So we're going to be exploring the palazzo and the gardens in our video today. I'm in the really impressive cortile, the grand courtyard of Palazzo Pitti. And as you can see, it really is a monumental space graced with a grotto here at the end, statues that were collected over the centuries by the Medici. Well, Palazzo Pitti in Florence has a very illustrious history. It was built by a banker called Luca Pitti in the 15th century. He was one of the rivals of the Medici, and indeed he based his own palazzo on the Medici's slightly earlier palace in Florence. But in 1549, Palazzo Pitti was bought by Eleonora of Toledo and her husband Cosimo de' Medici. So it became a Medici property. And from that point onwards, the Medici, when they became Grand Dukes of Tuscany, resided here, and this therefore became the Grand Ducal Palace. Eleonora of Toledo and Cosimo created behind the courtyard the Boboli Gardens, nearly 100 acres of gardens that rise up behind the fountain, the so-called artichoke fountain that you can see just there above the courtyard. As for this space, though, this in turn was a very influential space. It was designed by an architect called Bartolomeo Ammannati, a follower of Michelangelo, and it's a very interesting example of Mannerist architecture with these exaggerated features. And this sense of strength, it has a very sort of fortress-like quality, important sign of strength and power as a monument. But it was also influential on the history of theatre architecture, because this space here was used as a performance space. Notably, there was a famous event in 1589 for the wedding of Ferdinando I dei Medici to Christine of Lorraine, in which the entire courtyard was flooded, as it practically is today, because it's a very rainy day. It was flooded with water from the grotto. We can just walk over and see the grotto with its fountains of water. And essentially, the water was used to flood the entire courtyard. And in this space, the Medici reenacted a naval battle with virtually life-size galleys manned by sailors. And the battle was the Christians against the Ottoman Turks. And you can imagine the spectators sat around the balconies going around the courtyard here, or sat under the arches within, looking down onto this great spectacle, which was followed by fireworks and music. And this really begins a tradition of using spectacle as a form of Medici propaganda. And Palazzo Pitti really does become a very important stage for Medici propaganda. I'd like to introduce you to my chubby friend, Morgante. Morgante was a dwarf for the Medici. He was Cosimo I dei Medici's favorite entertainer, in fact. Cosimo enjoyed watching Morgante wrestle a monkey. Can you imagine? Anyway, he had Morgante immortalized, as you can see here, riding a tortoise. And indeed, the tortoise was the emblem of Cosimo de' Medici. His motto was Festina lente, make haste slowly. And so the tortoise was a symbol of moving slowly, but typically the tortoise had a sail on its back, and the sail obviously made the tortoise move more quickly, and so it embodied really the motto of Cosimo de' Medici, make haste slowly. And this is why Morgante is riding it. Actually, the sculpture was produced as part of a competition to see what was the more realistic art form, painting or sculpture. And along with the sculpture, Cosimo I had a painting of Morgante made by Agnolo Bronzino. Essentially, he painted a double-sided painting, front and back, and even had Morgante appear to move his head around. So as you walk from the front of the painting around to the back of the painting, Morgante appears to move. And so painting was every bit as realistic and three-dimensional as sculpture. This room was spectacularly frescoed with these trompe-l'oeil frescoes in 1637 for a Medici wedding, the wedding of Ferdinando I to Vittoria della Rovere. The fresco behind me shows Greek culture leaving Athens. It was done by Giovanni da San Giovanni, and it's a delightful depiction of Greek culture coming down from Athens into Florence. Of course, Florence was regarded as the new Athens. And there's some delightful things to look for. For instance, the figure over on the far right, dressed in yellow and blue, is Homer, the blind poet Homer. And he can't see that he's about to step out of the fresco and fall into the 21st century. So all around we have scenes of Greek culture being revived here in Florence in the Renaissance. For instance, over on this side, you can see in the red tunic with a red hat, Lorenzo de' Medici greeting the muses, the sister goddesses of the arts. And around, up and above, you see fabulous trompe-l'oeil techniques, a gallery, illusions of three-dimension, illusions of architecture, really creating an absolutely fabulous piece of Baroque fresco work in Florence. This is the third of the suite of rooms that were frescoed for that Medici wedding. Actually, the rooms were subsequently used in the summer months as living quarters because it was cooler down here. But this space was frescoed to celebrate the bride and groom, and notably up here at the top of the wall you can see the crest of the Medici family, those round balls, that's the Medici family's coat of arms. And then just below the crest you can see a portrait in a shell. Looks like a portrait bust of Alexander the Great. Groom of our wedding, Ferdinando I de' Medici, likened himself to Alexander the Great. These scenes that you see here are scenes from the life of Alexander the Great, and indeed they go all around the room. This is Alexander on his horse Bucephalus, and so it was a way to heroize the groom of that Medici wedding. This room also frescoed for the 1637 wedding, and using a spectacular technique called quadratura. That's an illusionary architecture combined with illusionary sculptures and reliefs. all done in grisaille, that's to say shades of grey and beige to look like stone, of course. The glittering Sala Bianca, the white hall that greets you and any visitor to Palazzo Pitti as the first room on the first floor of the palace. Well, this room was redecorated in the 1760s in this very extravagant style with white and pastel-coloured stucco, with chandeliers, with long gilded mirrors, and of course those mirrors face long windows, and therefore the effect of glittering, dazzling light is really overwhelming here. And the room was used as a ballroom under the Lorraine Grand Dukes of Tuscany. They were the successors to the Medici Grand Dukes when the Medici line died out. In more recent times, the Sala Bianca was used for catwalk shows. In the 1950s, actually, it established Florence as a major fashion centre, and still to this day there are international fashion shows in Florence that are called after Palazzo Pitti. We have Pitti Uomini and Pitti Immagini, but it all started here in the 50s in the Sala Bianca. So Palazzo Pitti was the residence for some very illustrious families. The Medici Grand Dukes, when the Medici died out, their successors were from the royal house of Lorraine, who came down from Vienna to Tuscany, and they resided in Palazzo Pitti. Then there was a brief Napoleonic interlude when Napoleon's sister, Elisa Bacciochi, lived here when Napoleon had conquered Tuscany. Then, at the end of Napoleon's regime, the Lorraine came back from Vienna. And finally, in 1865, when Florence became the capital of Tuscany, Palazzo Pitti became the residence for the royal family, and the new King Victor Emmanuel resided here. Having just mentioned Napoleon and Elisa Bacciochi, his sister, we can go through into the music room of Elisa Bacciochi, and it's rather delightful because you can see that on the walls are lamps shaped like French horns, and below those lamps are little tables that are actually in the shape of timpani drums. So even the furniture looks like musical instruments. We might imagine even some early Beethoven being performed in this space. Of course, Beethoven initially was a great admirer of Napoleon until Napoleon pronounced himself emperor, at which point Beethoven actually ripped up the dedication of his Eroica Symphony, the heroic symphony that was originally dedicated to Napoleon. But as I say, Beethoven ripped up that dedication. So we might imagine, as I say, some Beethoven being performed in this very room. We come through here into one of the great picture galleries of Palazzo Pitti, and as you can see from floor to ceiling, they are filled with paintings, very much the taste of the Baroque period, and reflecting also the concept of the horror vacui, the fear of emptiness, the fear of the tomb, ultimately, and therefore every space is filled with decoration, with ornament, with beautiful objects, the promise of paradise. This room has some exquisite early works, notably a number of tondi, round paintings that originally were commissioned to celebrate the birth of a child. For instance, over here, there's an exquisite work by Filippo Lippi, showing in the foreground the Madonna and Child, and in the background, scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, including at the far right, on the steps there, the meeting of Mary's mother and father, Anne and Joachim. And then over to the left, in bed, is Mary's mother, Anne, who has just given birth to Mary herself. And then, as I say, in the foreground, the exquisite portrait of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, this beautiful, tender, feminine, delicate style, so typical of Filippo Lippi. One of the most breathtaking rooms in Palazzo Pitti, the Hall of the Iliad. And it really shows this style of hanging paintings that was so much in vogue through the 1700s, when pictures were hung symmetrically on a balanced, sort of symmetrical arrangement. For instance, here we have the painting of Madonna of the Baldacchino by Fra Bartolomeo. And over on the other side, we have a symmetrically sized painting by Rosso Fiorentino. But if you look carefully, you can see that the painting doesn't actually fit the frame, and therefore the painting had to be extended. You can see the line, the original painting by Rosso Fiorentino, and then the extension all around, so that it fits the frame and therefore is symmetrical in size with the Fra Bartolomeo. And this was really quite common, actually, in the hangings of Palazzo Pitti. Paintings would often be extended to fit frames, or indeed cut down to fit frames in order to create this beautiful sort of balanced display. You can see from this viewpoint the extraordinary length of Palazzo Pitti, and in fact the second half of the palazzo is actually closed for restoration at the moment. So this is an enfilade of rooms, this long chain of rooms that was designed to show the great splendour of a building in one blink of the eye. Over to the left here, we have an exquisite work by Raphael, the Madonna and Child with the infant St. John the Baptist to the right. One of his most beautiful, tender portraits, showing also the influence of Michelangelo in that robust, strong Christ child, and the more tender influence of Raphael's teacher, Perugino. Now, this is just one work by Raphael. Indeed, Palazzo Pitti has the largest collection of Raphaels, largest single collection of Raphaels in any collection, so it's really most impressive, along with great works by Titian, Rubens, Giorgione, Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi. So it is an extraordinary showcase for Renaissance and Baroque art. This long hall, the Sala delle Nicchie, named after the niches with statues in them. It was a great display case for Medici's collection of sculptures from classical antiquity. And later it became the dining hall of the palazzo. But before this was turned into the dining hall, you could eat anywhere you wanted at any time of day that you wanted. So we can wander down the Sala delle Nicchie and out into the Boboli Gardens. As you come into the Boboli Gardens, you're greeted with this beautiful view over the rooftops of Florence. You can see some of its most famous monuments. Of course, you can see the dome of the Duomo. And beyond it, in the further distance, there is the hill of Fiesole. Today, a picturesque little town that overlooks Florence, but actually the whole story of civilized life in this area started up there in Fiesole, which was an Etruscan settlement from the 8th century BC, so many centuries before Florence was founded. Fiesole was a proud Etruscan city overlooking and dominating the valley. Today we're going to explore the Boboli Gardens, which extend up the hill and encompass about 100 acres of land. The space that I'm standing in here originally was a stone quarry, and it was from that quarry that all the stone to build the impressive Palazzo Pitti was drawn, and other monuments too were built from stone from this quarry. When the Medici bought Palazzo Pitti then, they decided to level out the quarry, and around it subsequently was created a Roman-style amphitheatre. You can see, just as the ancient Romans did, they had stone steps for seating, and then above the stone steps going all the way around are niches with sculptures and great colossal vases in them. Again, another way to display the Medici's collections of statues from antiquity. And the central space then was used for multimedia entertainment. They had equestrian ballets with horses prancing around, choreographed here, all part of Medici propaganda, of course. Always the themes of these multimedia spectacles would be to celebrate the Medici and their reign. So the open-air amphitheatre in the Boboli Gardens then really was an important place for Medici stagecraft. Looking back from the centre of the Roman-style amphitheatre, you can see the splendid artichoke fountain, as it's called, that dominates the courtyard of Palazzo Pitti, and of course you can see the palazzo behind. One of the interesting things about the Boboli Gardens is this interplay between statues, fountains, and greenery. It lies absolutely at the heart of the ethos of the Renaissance Italian garden, this dialogue really between stone, water, and foliage. Then turning round, we can look up towards the upper parts of the Boboli Gardens, and you'll see the very prominent pairing of ancient works here. There's an ancient Roman granite bath on a monumental scale that came out of ancient Roman baths and was placed here in the garden as a garden ornament. And then rising up behind it is an ancient Egyptian obelisk. Again, it was actually brought from Egypt to Rome, first of all, and later placed in the Boboli Gardens, connecting the Medici Grand Dukes and the Lorraine Grand Dukes after them with the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, of course, so a splendid symbol of power. When the Boboli Gardens were originally laid out by Eleanor of Toledo and Cosimo de' Medici. They really followed largely a very geometric plan in the style of the Italian Renaissance garden, of course, and one can see paintings of the gardens as they were. In the 16th century, for instance, there's a lunette by Giusto Utens from 1599 that shows us this very geometrical planting. And of course, this is absolutely part of Renaissance style. In geometry lies perfection. This sort of ordered, controlled garden transitioned from the hard lines of the architecture of Palazzo Pitti, ultimately transitioning to the natural landscape beyond at the top of the hill. The point that I'm standing at now, though, is certainly one of these sort of transitional points. We have a little pond here with a fountain in the centre of it. And looking up to the hill, you can see that the gardens rise up to quite a height. And indeed, from the very top, there are seraphic views across the Tuscan countryside. So we'll wander on up there now. It's really worth the climb up the hill of the Boboli Gardens to reach this beautiful viewpoint from the Giardino del Cavalieri, which really crowns the gardens. And you can see across these sweet Tuscan hills. You can see in the far distance there's the church of San Miniato al Monte, which is the oldest surviving church in Florence, in fact. And coming round, you can see what were old Tuscan farmhouses and villas that sweep across the hillside here, stretching up to a neo-Gothic castle that crowns the hill of Pian de Giuliari. And Pian de Giuliari up there is where Galileo Galilei spent the last decade of his life under house arrest. And therefore, later, in the 19th century, on the hill to the far right there, an observatory was established, the Observatory of Arcetri, which really was dedicated to Galileo, and of course it is still a working observatory. So really wonderful view of the Tuscan hills. The Giardino del Cavaliere is laid out with these low parterres of box hedging and flowers, of course, between the parterres. At the back is a lemon house, a limonaia, which would have been used to overwinter lemons in the chilly months of the year. And then we look out onto the old city walls, in fact. Cascading down from the gardens, you can see there the 14th century city walls and a watchtower and the green hills and little villas and houses of Florence stretching out into the distance. This is an impressive piece of contemporary sculpture in the Boboli Gardens by a Polish sculptor called Mitraj. It continues the tradition of sculpture in a dialogue with the gardens. But this one really was intended to show, on the one hand, the fragility of all things, but on the other hand, it was inspired by classical sculptures, notably the great colossal Roman sculptures that you can still see to this day in Rome, and therefore by classical ideas of beauty. Well, the larger of the two lakes in the Boboli Gardens is graced with a little island. And of course, both the lake and the island were used throughout the Medici's residency in Palazzo Pitti as a sort of food supply. So you'd have fish in the waters, ducks, geese, maybe chickens on the island, protected from foxes. And imagine the sound of trickling water from these ornamental fountains all around the lake. There's a rather nice little detail at the top of the entrance of sculpted Capricorn. And the Capricorn was the zodiac sign of Cosimo de' Medici, Duke Cosimo, who ultimately became the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. And he liked to make this association between himself and the zodiac sign of Capricorn, because two other rather famous people were Capricorns, Julius Caesar and Jesus Christ. So how's that for a piece of marketing? Today it's a rather idyllic spot. There are many secrets in the Boboli Gardens, and indeed that was also part of Renaissance Italian garden style, that the garden shouldn't reveal itself all at once, but you should discover secret rooms, as it were, green rooms and little passageways and covered walkways and pergolas and so on. And so this is absolutely one of the delights, I think, of exploring the gardens, that you keep discovering these secrets. You can also see on the island in beautiful terracotta pots the many citrus plants that are cultivated here, so lemons, mandarins, clementines and so on. And this actually reflects a tradition that goes right back to when the Medici first purchased Palazzo Pitti, 16th century into the 17th century. The Boboli Gardens are enjoying something of a renaissance today, in that the gardeners have started to revive certain techniques of cultivating plants, and notably vines. The Moscatello grape is grown in a certain part of the gardens, just as it was cultivated under the Medici. So the gardens, over 100 acres of land, a wonderful way to while away your spare hours in Florence.